So I say hello also to them. Welcome back to our, what we might define a joint initiative, Center for Urban Studies, TU Delft today. So some of you might be familiar with the urban studies lectures that we do at the Pakhuis Zwijger in this location. We do them every year and in different occasions. This year we also experimenting with a cooperation with the University of TU Delft, namely Tom Damen, my colleague here, and me, Federico Savini, will be your host today, and we organized this event. I also would like to immediately thank you, our sponsors, because this event is made possible also by the SLIM Foundation. Yalan is here, our president of the foundation, that kindly help us to invite good speakers from abroad and to organize this kind of debate. So we're very happy for it. I would like to introduce you. In the meanwhile, I'm looking there at our technician, which is very concentrated, because probably is, hello, short? Yeah. Is it going well? No, not yet. Only probably my name there. Does not work. That's not an issue, actually. There's not much to see. It was just my name. That's with the presentation which was made. Few people are coming back. So before to start, I would like just to introduce you to the theme of this event. Here we are. And I will be very general, also because the idea of this event is to debate. We will try to organize an open and smooth debate with the room and the speakers. And I will tell you in a second how we organize it. So that's the real essence of the meeting today. You will not receive big lectures. The only thing we will say is few things about the theme and few pitches by a selected number of people that I will introduce one by one. Now, the theme, Rethinking Urban Growth. Some of you might have immediately thought about, okay, what is this? It's probably about the number of people living in a city or in a region or in Holland. Well, it's much broader than that. I would like to start introducing the theme talking about the economy, just to take it very specific. So since few decades, and in particular since 2008, global financial crisis, the last of many crises we had in history, in fact, we learned few things about our economy. One thing that we learn very clearly is that it's not always stable. It's very prone to some shocks. And these shocks affect cities. The way cities develop, projects that are put in place, and the way cities adapt to these shocks. That's the first we learn. The second thing that we learn, and we kind of learn it all the time more and more, is that our economy is not necessarily environmentally friendly. Actually, it's environmentally dangerous. It requires a number of resources and is based on the model that, in fact, has serious limits, physical limits. And this is, again, another almost undiscussed and agreed upon principle. And the third aspect is that we discovered, again, in 2008, that our economy is not always fair. It's often very unequal in terms of social equality. And this also affects cities. When we talk about affordability, access to housing, access to space, in times of growing or recession, this issue comes always to the fore. And I have to add also a fourth one that we are slowly learning a lot. Our economy doesn't always make us very happy. There is a lot of work that talks about the human aspects of growth and economic growth, how people perceive that, how people live their relationship with work, with friendship, with green, urban space. So there are all kinds of issues with it. Now, what we're going to do today with a number of speakers, we'll try to discuss in a very open way what is the role of cities in developing new ideas or new principles of growth, or better said, prosperity, or better said, happiness, who knows. I will not say much more in specific and details for it, because every speaker will have his or her own opinion on this and specific view. And that's why we decided also to diversified very much our lineup of invited speakers. So you will hear different stories. Now, the evening is going to work as following. It's very simple. We have two parts. The first part will be seen the participation of 3 speakers that will give a short pitch. After the speech, the speakers will sit on the table and we will open the discussion to the room. And about after 1 hour, we will start with, again, the second part. My colleague Tom Dahmen will take over the microphone and moderate the second part with another lineup of 4 speakers. So I would like to invite immediately the first of our speakers, Paul Chatterton. Here, professor at the University of Leeds. He was so kind to come all the way from Leeds, escaping the Brexit debate. I heard it was very nice for him to be here today. No escape. We invited him to give a pitch, and by the way, he also gave a lecture today, this morning, to a number of students about his last book, Unlocking Sustainable Cities. And in this book, it provides with a manifesto for rethinking urban growth, I would say. So, Paul, I invite you to give your pitch.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Federico. Thank you. It's great to be here for this 24-hour whistle-stop tour, so thank you very much for allowing me some time to engage with some ideas. I did have a bag full of these books at the beginning of the day. I've only got one left, so that could go to anybody who wants one. I'm selling them at the end. I should have brought more. But basically, I want to try and summarize this book in the next 3 minutes. My career is somewhere between being an activist, a social entrepreneur, and an academic. And I think I'm trying to bring those 3 worlds together because I think that's the key to unlocking real urban sustainability. But my overall argument is that we need a new radical triple bottom line for cities, okay? And that constitutes the following. Beyond the age of carbon, right? So what we're calling the post-carbon city, yeah, beyond the age of fossil fuel dependency. The post-growth city, so really thinking what's the new storyline for how we prosper in cities, yeah, beyond ceaseless solely economic growth. And then the post-unequal city, yeah? How do we find a new deal? So that sounds way too Brexit, doesn't it? The kind of thing Theresa May would say. How do we find a new deal for social equality, what I call a common city, right? In the book, I have 4 chapters, and I'll give you the headline from each of these chapters. Basically, the car-free city takes this kind of agenda seriously, but how do we unlock cities from car culture, this deep psychological, geopolitical, and technical and planning and behaviour change lock-in to this thing called car culture? Here we are in Amsterdam. From my point of view, Leeds, one of the leading lights in the world of somebody who's trying to get hold of the low-hanging fruit in terms of unlocking themselves from car culture. But the car-free city is a much deeper narrative in terms of how we tackle climate breakdown and mobility injustice by unlocking ourselves from automobile, fossil fuel, privatized, corporate-led mobility, right? That is the big challenge for cities after you've done the low-hanging fruit like a city like Amsterdam has done. The post-carbon city is an equally important challenge, which is how does a city become compliant to the Paris Agreement target of holding global temperatures to 1.5 degrees, okay? That is the humanity challenge we have over the next 12 to 25 years. What would a city look like if we reconfigure the social and political practices in a locality to that 1.5 degree target? That's the post-carbon challenge. The Biocity challenge is equally challenging because it's about us. It's the existential challenge. How do we reconnect with nature and the natural systems which are our life support system? How to reconnect humans to humans and humans to nature and humans to other animal species to avoid, quite frankly, the biological and animal-based annihilation which is occurring. So what would our cities look like which fundamentally reconnected to nature? And rewilding is a really big part of that story. And then finally, the common city. How do we build community wealth? How do we hold value? Cities are full of value. How do we hold them? How do we recirculate them for the benefit of local communities, what we call community wealth building? These 4 things together, the car-free city, the post-carbon city holding to the Paris Agreement, the bio-city where we reconnect to nature, and the common city where we rebuild and retain community wealth, together are the secret to unlocking sustainable cities. Now, if there was a next slide of my final one, which I sneaked one in, it's because this is how we do it. It's these 4 sectors working in combination, yeah? No one sector alone can do this. No one institution alone can do this. It's dissident researchers. It's renegade government officials. It's breakthrough entrepreneurs. And it's radical citizens working in combination who are the key to the great unlocking, working together and equally. So it's think big, start small, but start now.
Thank you, Paul. Please, you can already, I think, sit there.
On my own, in the middle.
Yes, I'm sorry. Everybody's going to watch you for a few minutes.
Right,
you will be in good company very soon. Yes. Be patient. You won't be alone.
No, it's fine. Yeah.
Thank you. As I said, we're working for pitches just to kind of trigger your attention and your questions. So it's very short talks. Now, our second speaker, Carolyn Schippers. Many of you probably know her very well. She's the deputy director of the land development department of the city of Amsterdam, and we're very happy to have you here. And I leave you immediately the mic.
Yes, thank you. I had also a slide, and I was thinking very hard of it because I also can have a slide from the city of Amsterdam, of course, but that's where I work for. But I chose another city, and this is Sydney. And you see a part of the park near the Opera House, the Domain. And I was there 7 years ago. Now, I won't say that again because we can't fly anymore for the sustainability. But at that time, I saw this sign in the park. And it says the Domain is for everyone to enjoy. Please walk on the grass. We also invite you to hug the trees, picnic on the grass, and talk to the birds. And I was very moved by that sign. And if you see, if you are there in the park and you see the beautiful opera house, but behind that there are very high skyscrapers. So it's also a city with 5 million people, so it's very, in parts, high density, a lot of people who live there. And I thought if we are talking about urban growth, we talk, as Paul has number of topics like mobility, density, the energy transition, and all that. And in my job, I also talk about legal issues and about money and about who can use land and about all that kind of things. But why I picked this picture particularly is that if you want to develop the city, you only can do it very well if you look at the details, even as such a sign. So it's going to be, if you can do it right, if you look at the specifics. So the English say the devil is in the details, but the French say mon Dieu c'est dans les détails. So it's God, it's in the details. And I think we can make our city more dense, and we can have housing for more people here, but then you have to do it at every level right. So for the transportation, for the energy transition, for the quality of your housing, the way we want to look for the public space, for everything. So that's my pitch.
Very important. We need to get really everything right, otherwise we don't manage. This is important. Last speech for the first part, Antonio Ferreira here, colleague from the University of Porto, researcher in transport, environment, mobility. Here's your microphone.
Thank you. I'll start by making this question. Do you know how Buddha got enlightened? How did he get enlightened? What happened? What did he do? Do you know? Yes, Buddha. How did Buddha got enlightened?
Sitting under a tree.
Sitting under a tree. Remarkable. So after we talking so much about growth, and apparently the most effective form to get into enlightenment seems to be just do nothing, sit under a tree, and I don't know what then happens. Something happens, and that should be good for you. But perhaps you don't know what happens before Buddha went sitting under the tree. You know what was his story? Just before that, no, you know?
He was a very rich guy.
He was a very rich guy, and he leaves all his richnesses. But what does he do after that? It's very interesting. He goes seeking for enlightenment real hard. He travels all across the place. He seeks all masters. He presents himself to the wildest techniques and the hardest techniques. And the reason why he sits under the tree is because he's exhausted. He's near basically dead, right? And it's in that moment that he says, I need to stop. And in that moment, pop, he gets enlightened. And I think this is a wonderful metaphor. Not in the, forget the religious aspect, but let's go into the mythical aspect. I think it's a wonderful metaphor for what is going on at the moment. For many years, we have been seeking hard, working hard, promoting growth, going forward, traveling everywhere, seeking all sorts of things. And I think it came to the moment in which it is necessary to sit more under the tree. I work especially in transport planning, and I've been developing work with people in this room, namely, for example, Luca Bertolini, on the idea of being more in the place where you belong to. And so the question that comes from is, where are your roots? And how come your connection with your roots be a good thing? Because it is also an opportunity for things like parochialism, racism, vulnerability. And so it's really intriguing questions, and I look forward to discuss this and other things with you.
Thank you, Antonio. Well, here we have the first three speeches, and I would like to invite the room to kind of bring up issues, questions, feedbacks, topics, and be very open and free. We have these speakers, also other speakers in the room that will talk later, may want to pop in if they want to say something. So we're trying to do it as a debate. Anybody wants to have a first word? Yes, there. I will keep the microphone.
Okay. Then I will.
First rule of the moderator.
Okay, cool. So hi, my name is Naz, and I would like to ask, you talked about details, and to me lately it seemed that urban growth is becoming something equal to making homogeneous cities, at least the city centers, with pushing out people who are more poor, with social housing out of the city, with eviction of squats, with eviction of social spaces, and just building these skyscrapers. And I feel like this is the detail that has been neglected the most during the recent urban growth patterns. What would you think, what are the ways to tackle this and how to go on with this? I mean, Amsterdam is kind of a tricky example as well. I mean, last week the ADM was evicted, and then there are many histories of as such in the last decades. So the cultural DNA of the city is changing, and kind of I would like to know what is your opinion.
Carolyn, you have something to say?
Well, yes, we have now. I don't know. We have, of course, the debate on the affordable housing. And now when we are building new housing in Amsterdam, we have a rule, and it's called 40-40-20. So it's about percentages, and we are building 40% affordable housing and 40% in the middle class and 20% for the expensive housing. So and we are doing that all over Amsterdam now, and of course we are not building again in the city center, but everywhere where we are building, that's the way we are doing it. And we are now practicing also, you see that we, where the spaces are still available, we want to make room for housing, for shops, for everything like that. But we are also making new breeding places, so for the cultural. So I think we make an inclusive city for all the people and for all the aspects.
Can I add something? How do we keep rent for artists moderate in the city?
Yes, in Amsterdam we call it broedplaatsen. And until January, it was also in my department. So we are making new spaces also for the artists. So, and there's one example where the artists have to go away, but we also make new ones. And we have more places for artists now than about 2-3 years ago.
So you're saying that it's increasing the diversity
Yeah.
of cultural expression in the city of Amsterdam?
Yes.
Okay.
Can I just make a
Yes, of
quick
course.
response? And also, the taxation system is a big part of this, right? How we control and yield the best benefits from multinational capital when it comes to our cities. So shifting the burden from income tax to land tax is one of the ideas that needs to come to ground over the next generation. Because this is a global story, right? There's a lot of money in the world, and it's landing in cities to maximise returns for shareholders. We need to control that process, so we need national legislation to do that. So big shifts in the taxation system from income to land is what I want to see.
Yeah, Antonio?
I use the opportunity to say that I perhaps am a bit critical of the policy adopted in Amsterdam, but not just Amsterdam. Majority of the cities that are going into this competitive logic, because I perhaps see too little cooperation between cities. And so what tends to happen is that each city tends to operate as a kind of a magnet of resources, of people, of money, etc. And so what happens is that I think that majority of cities end up being in really difficult situations, shrinking in terrible ways, while others are growing in terrible ways. And so I think that would be more interesting if we had a more harmonic system in which some cities would try to direct the growth toward other cities instead of trying to capture it for themselves.
Well, I was just two questions. One for Paul. Now that you've also visited here and given your book, can you reflect a little bit on the differences between, you mentioned taxation, for example, between what we have here in the Netherlands, which arguably can be called more equitable than what we see in the UK, or do you have another opinion or observation about that? How do you reflect on the differences between countries?
Well, over dinner just earlier, we were talking about the differences in terms of, do you have a spatial narrative for a particular country? I mean, your spatial planning narrative has been weakened, but you've still got one, whereas we don't have a spatial narrative for the UK, apart from that London can have whatever it wants, yeah? So that's one thing that we lack compared to the Netherlands. Yeah, and we don't have any sense of regional redistribution. I don't know what you've got going on here, but you've got some, there's some kind of that through the spatial planning system. Yeah, so there's a huge historic power imbalance within the UK political space, and that needs to be remedied significantly. So that's probably the main difference, right?
Was about what you mentioned about the car-free city. I was just talking with the head of the infrastructure department of this city here this morning, and she observes that the younger generation, arguably in the room here, is less prone to get a car and get into a car every day and, drive to work, well, at least, drive to parking lots. And is it in your research, has it come to your attention that this sort of transition, would you say, well, with everything that has been going on since the, let's say, 60s came up and we had this culture of car use, maybe in the UK that's the case, but do you see also some autonomous changes there that you maybe also haven't foreseen?
Yeah, no, we've hit peak car. We are living through peak car. Yeah, the issue is we need to turn the tailpipes off quicker to stop climate breakdown. So the long tail towards the end of car culture will last 20, 30 years. We need to shut down the tailpipes within 5 years. So who's going to be up for that? Yeah, it'll happen anyway, but not quick enough.
Yes, Willem?
I have also a question for Paul. You're from Leeds, and my first association with Leeds is Norbert Stiles. I mean, Leeds used to be an industrial city. Your agenda is a green agenda, is a climate agenda. And I just wonder, is there a political regime that would support this kind of agenda in Leeds?
Actually, what I found is that climate is really not very useful to organise around, right? And I tend not to be a climate activist or a climate researcher for that reason. I prefer to be a anti-poverty researcher, because actually giving the most marginalised and low-income communities back their potential, I think, is the quickest way to solving the climate breakdown problem we're facing. So it's a proxy, really. So I don't see it as the climate's breaking down as a result of the intense, unequal, neoliberal economic system we've had over the last 50 years, in particular, or going back to the Industrial Revolution, if you'd like. But we need to shift from this post-growth economy, right? Carbon's not just landing in the atmosphere because it's some odd chemical process, yeah? It's the intense process of industrial urbanisation that we've developed and we've prospered from. We all love it. We have great lives. We all have great lives, right? We're living in the carbon age. We're having a fantastic life here in the West, yeah? So it's going to be difficult to shift from it quick enough.
But the question, what kind of politics do we need? Maybe I pose it also to Carolyn.
Yes.
What kind of politics do we need to enable this?
Within 5 years.
An anti-poverty social justice agenda, yeah? So this is about climate justice, yeah?
Carolyn, you have an opinion on this?
Well, perhaps, I don't know. What do you say?
Shoot.
Of course, so there's inequality. There's poverty in the city sometimes. And we have to do, but how do you connect it with the climate discussion and that we have to finish it within 5 years? So what do we have to do, according to you, to get there?
Well, I don't know.
Okay.
No, I kind of got some ideas, but let's keep the debate going. I mean, yeah,
Well, you
absolutely.
mentioned something. I mean, taxation is one way, for example.
Well, I mean, we need to completely reconfigure work, decarbonise the way our economy is run, but we need to use the scarce resources we have left, the scarce carbon budget we have left, right, to achieve some important things. Because we've only got a few gigatons of carbon we can put into the atmosphere. We need to use those to patch up the economy, to work on social justice, to introduce some serious anti-poverty measures, to get the kind of housing, the social housing we need, to build the infrastructure we need, to completely saturate our cities with zero carbon technologies and infrastructures and civic energy systems, yeah, and totally green our infrastructures. So we've only got a little bit of production capacity left to be able to do that. So there's a huge amount of wasteful labour going on, right, within the financial sector in particular, which is not generating wealth. It's just shifting wealth around to the financial elite. We need to renegotiate all that energy back into the productive sector to get this kind of green equal economy working on its feet.
That's clear. There was a question here.
My question is about the general myopia that I often hear in debates like this. Of course, we are all very concerned with post-carbon, sustainable and small cities. And of course, Amsterdam, we're living in one of the cities that quite rightly prides itself on moving in that direction and having continuous debates on this. However, the elephant in the room here, it seems to me, is that cities like Amsterdam are buying their post-carbon energy transition by spitting out carbon somewhere else. For a post-industrial, deindustrialized city like Amsterdam, it ain't that difficult. It ain't that difficult to be post-carbon, provided that we get our IT hardware, our clothes, our cars from China and India. So don't forget that Amsterdam's everyday material life is predicated upon pumping gigantic volumes of carbon out in Beijing, Guangdong, and places like that. And I don't understand, really do not understand this persistence of the myopia by well-meaning academics and professionals and sustainability activists that our sustainability is often yet predicated upon sustaining unsustainability, both in terms of justice as well as in ecological concerns elsewhere. Just to give you a little indicator, between 2014 and 2017, China pumped as much concrete in its cities as the whole of the US in the 20th century in order to make our consumption in Amsterdam possible. And don't forget, your emails account for 2% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you, Eric. This is a good critique. I want to also add, isn't it the elephant in the room, consumption? So the needs that we satisfy every day and we think are unquestionable. Isn't the lifestyle also an issue in that sense that might unlock this problem of being dependent on resources that are imported somewhere else? Does anybody want to give a reply to this critique?
Okay, I mean, this is the difference between scope 1 and 2 and scope 3 emissions, right? Which is the elephant in the room. What we have now is an international process, the latest COP process, is embarking upon an accounting framework where we can start to, for the first time, understand what a national level scope 3 and a city level scope 3 emissions are, right? And this is really important, so Eric, well done for raising it. The point is that if we just look at scope 1 and 2 emissions, in-city emissions from primary energy consumption and the things that are directly attributable to your lives, we meet our climate targets, right, as a city, and we're within the Paris Agreement of 1.5 degrees. If you add scope 3 emissions, which is the invisible consumption emissions external to the city, we're on target for 4 or 5 degrees. So if every city if the world was like Amsterdam, we'd be toast, right? So that's or Leeds or Edinburgh, it doesn't really matter which city. So how do we recalibrate back to that? But this is contraction and convergence. So all the rich global northern cities curtailing rapidly, allowing the global south cities to increase a little bit. We converge around a common point and then go forward as humanity. I mean, that's a global deal where we have to sit down. That's a geopolitical deal between China, the US, and Europe and the rest of the world. But given things are fragmenting unilaterally, I'm not sure how we get there. But you're spot on. So it brings us into the question. The unsustainability is directly about us questioning our lifestyles, how we live and what we buy.
Antonio, do you have something to add on this?
I do. I would disagree with the way you finished.
Microphone.
Right.
Sorry, guys. I would disagree with the way you finished. I think it's not really, and you're very aware of Elizabeth Shove, of course, argument that is not so much about our lifestyles. I don't think that people in this room as individuals have much that they can do, really. They can try to do minor improvements, but so the issue is much more at a wider political level. And I think that what's happening is that, unfortunately, it is my strong opinion, the European Union, it became a mechanism of promoting what was described by Eric. And if we look into the kind of documents and policies they are promoting, I kind of almost say I agree with Brexit. I want to get out of that, but in a different way.
Lexit.
Lexit.
Really said that?
And so there are two pet hates I have in terms of the dominant narratives that are going at the moment. One is the knowledge economy, which I think is the economy of that. And so we have us kind of presenting PowerPoint presentations to each other, getting a lot of money out of that, and guys in China destroying their cities and their environment, so that we can continue in this privileged high level thing. And so in this way, this setting in which we have here represents that. We are here presenting PowerPoint presentations to each other, kind of, like talking about it. And so there is that problem. But I think it's good, because in the end, it's not about we. I don't think it's each one of us as individuals that I'm going to buy some kind of yogurt that I'm going to save the other. And the other one is this social innovation in general. Debate, I think, is total BS, to be honest. There is this tendency I think we're trying to go into this immaterial way of thinking about the economy, and the consequence of that is that money is increasingly less a tangible thing. So one thing is to say, okay, so if you need, I don't know, this commodity, let's call it, and that represents a certain amount of money. Okay, that is tangible. But as we go into this knowledge economy in which things are increasingly more abstract, then money becomes also increasingly more abstract and difficult to know what we're talking about when we talk about a certain amount of coin. And so I'm Portuguese, in case you didn't know.
Okay.
And
Start broad, Antonio.
Sorry?
try to finish the point.
And so, just to say that now in Portugal we have talks like 100 million euros, 700 million euros. This is banal these days. And how is it possible that we talk about these figures these days? Knowledge economy.
Yes.
Thanks, Maria Keika. I think it's important to not talk about urban growth in a geographical or a historical way. Urban growth in China today is a very different animal than urban growth in Amsterdam, in Shanghai, different to Amsterdam. Yet, those two animals live in a symbiotic manner. So what happened in our in Western cities, after the 1990s, we had a capital switch from productive activities to real estate investor, with all the consequences that had for financialization of real estate, massive building of unnecessary, actually, buildings and housing units. And all that could be done, or actually became imperative for expanding Western economies through switching to real estate and overbuilding, because all the productive activities went to Asia, China, yeah? So we cannot think of Amsterdam's growth in a vacuum, yeah? I'm echoing Eric's point to a certain extent. However, then is the real question a question of growth, or is the real question a question of distribution of wealth and what happens with this wealth when it's invested into real estate activities in cities? And why is it that in the many debates have been, very good debates, there's always a question about the creative class and what's going to happen in Amsterdam, and I haven't heard anything about what happens with the refugees in Amsterdam. They're invisible. Invisible in the city, invisible in the debate. Where are they? What happens to those people? It's really nice to know. Or how can we distribute this growth to these people as well?
Well, we're lucky because, Carolyn, you want to say something? Or you were involved in a project of refugee housing in Amsterdam. You want to say something about that in particular? How does it relate also to the contemporary model of urban and real estate expansion that the city is witnessing? Huge, by the way. So, yeah.
Well, I'm for the city development now, but my last job 1 year ago, I was for the refugees in Holland. So I housed them. And what you see is sometimes I'm practical. So we have an whole global economy with a lot of stress on the sustainability. But sometimes you have to ask what you can do now and here and start now, like Paul asked. And I think if you look at as well as the sustainability as the affordable housing, as we call it now, the refugees or the special groups, we have to accommodate them, and we will, and we do. So I think we look all in the city for housing, for refugees, and for everyone to house here, and to start also with a sustainable city by making perhaps small steps, but they have to be there also. More room for bikes, more things in the housing for. Even bird caves and things like that. So I think we make steps. Perhaps it's not enough. Perhaps it should be more radical. But I think you have to start somewhere.
Can you give an example, maybe briefly, of one of these steps for the refugees?
For the refugees, well, we have. If you see. In Holland now, the refugees are there are less refugees, but we have enough housing if there will be more. So that's one of the things we do. So we are prepared to have more refugees if it's possible, if it's necessary.
Okay, good. There was a question here.
Yes, I would like to take back the discussion from all the way in China to us here in this room, in this city. I heard two pitches, one saying do nothing and the other one saying do everything. Where for me, I'm just a simple inhabitant and also civil servant of the city. I'm thinking cities are the place where you can do something and try out if it works and then see if you can get there. So do you agree with me on that, or is it too simple a way of getting somewhere?
Who was it? No, who was who though? I don't. Who was everything? Who was nothing?
You're everything.
Mine could have been so many things.
Carolyn
It becomes nothing.
Maybe it's the same thing.
I know exactly. So, what is your job? Sorry.
I'm also a civil servant, and I would like to know or try out or find out what's something we can do, to rethink urban growth.
You're looking for some meaning in your job.
Yeah.
Right. Good. So, what you could do if you've got ability to do this, what I would do if I was you is I would designate experimental sites across the city, or resources or assets, could be buildings, and open them up to unlock them to community groups to innovate experimentally low-cost measures in terms of community wealth building, small-scale social enterprise, civic energy supplies, urban food production, low impact housing, right? I designate 10 experimental sites and trial them, learn from them, see how they went. If they went well, take them to some kind of boss or higher up and say, it went really well, let's have another 10 sites, another 50 sites, scale and scale and scale, right, to create some kind of urban laboratory. Turn Amsterdam into an urban laboratory rather than a corporate warehouse, yeah? So every city in the world could do this. It's about unlocking the potential. Going back to Maria's point, there's a phenomenal amount of wealth slushing around. We need the wealth creators. What we don't need are the billionaires, right, who are masquerading as wealth creators. We need to have national and international, national and global policy to get our hands back on some of this proper corporate wealth so we can reinvest it into the wealth creators at the community level who can solve climate breakdown, social inequality, poverty, food production, blue-green infrastructure, all this kind of stuff that we need to work on, right? All the things that matter to us, childcare, kindergarten provision, all those stuff which we can do if people unlocked and gave us the resources to do it.
Thank you.
I'll come and help you. If you do get those, I'll come and help you if you get those resources.
Well,
Yeah, Carolyn, you are.
yes. Well, I think we do a lot of them. Actually, yeah.
Absolutely. I've heard lots of great things happening.
Yes. But we do it both. So we also accommodate the wealthiest and yeah, of course. And we have to have business, so we have to because we have to work here, and but we also make smaller things. We make cooperations. We have an alderman who wants to make a skill up of that, and I think it's and perhaps we can do it more, but I think we do the most of these things.
But I can add something. I mean, we know that in Holland, 2/3 of all subsidies for innovation in the field of energy and resources go to the multinational corporations that live here, from Tata Steel to Shell, while only 1/3 goes to all kind of initiatives, experimental initiatives, often local, that are taking place in cities.
Mm-hmm.
Is that maybe a question, of redistribution, in fact, at a higher level than the city? Or, I don't know, how do you see your colleagues from the national government, European government, in promoting, in allowing you to do better what you already do, apparently?
I think that's still a puzzle, and we are we are debating about that, and we are thinking about it. But it's also true that because everybody wants to go to the city, I don't know if we attract them. Perhaps we do, but they also want to be here, and that we have to accommodate that, and that because that's the way how economy works, that will rise up the prices. And if you want to make then a real good distribution from money, land, everything, you really have to make a level playing field for everyone. And that's very hard to do. So that's a challenge to do that right. So you don't only want a few groups that are very special or unique, or you want it for everyone that they can come in and have place here.
Tony, briefly?
Just this, so the Netherlands, when I was a student of planning in the beginning, was presented as being the example of planning with teeth. I actually saw that in a paper, planning with teeth, meaning that it's planning that can do. And it can do because it has a strong state that could, among other things, have public housing, meaning that the state would have a share of the housing available. And through that, it will have a greater capacity to control the housing market, namely the prices, but also the conditions lived by people in the city. And in that sense, I don't particularly know why we have to continuously innovate, because I think that, as far as I understand, the Netherlands got it right some time ago. And then I'm not sure exactly why the Netherlands at the moment is so into this innovation thing, experimental thing, when the solutions to me have always been there, and we kind of know, have been taught by planning academics for many years, and now we are into this innovation thing. How this came to be? Because peculiar, because the Netherlands was before presented as the great example of good planning, and now it's just innovating, and it's peculiar.
What happened to the Dutch planning paradise? Carolyn? That's how they used to call it.
Yes.
Quickly, if you have a feedback on it.
Well, we have still the corporations. So we have still the social housing, and that's still a great part of Amsterdam.
Is decreasing, isn't it?
Huh?
Is decreasing, reducing the number.
A little bit. It's about 45%, I think. So
Even more.
now from the total of the housing. So it's still quite. It's a little bit decreasing, but it's still quite a big amount. But the question is, if you want to have, if the corporations, you can also have the co-operations. And in the co-operations, there are people who also have a lot of potential and energy and creativity. You can also allow them to have a part in Amsterdam or in the city. And then you get a new energy.
You mean cooperative housing?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that's a model.
Yeah.
Experimented. There was a question here.
Yes, I would like to go back to your three beautiful pitches and actually ask each of you what is the politics implied by your visions. And by politics, I mean not so much what to do, but how to get there, how to decide what to do. So in the case of Paul, you show these visions, but you also show the powerful interests that are holding them back. It's not something we all agree around. There are conflicts there. But then you come in the end with this idea of the quadruple helix, urban experimentation, which is a very consensual vision. It kind of seems to assume there's a lot of criticism about that. We are all agree. And so I cannot really square the two together. So I like to understand that better. Because of Antonio, I'm really fascinated by your idea of Buddha sitting under a tree. What is the political, what means that politically? What is the politics of, what does it mean sitting under a tree in political terms? And again, politics in the sense of interact. And to Carolyn, my question would be, okay, what is the politics, again, that will lead to the good details? That is an outcome, but what is the politics that can create such outcomes?
I ask you another pitch. Which of you? 1 minute each.
I can go.
Antonio, you start.
So I think the great problem we have today is that we have monolithic forms of policymaking becoming increasingly more powerful. European Commission, for me, is an example of that. And I think what, in part, sitting under the tree means is that each different place should have a specific political configuration that might not be democratic, by the way. Exactly. Might not be democratic if people are not willing to have a democratic setup. And I think being able to think in these terms is difficult because we tend to think that there are dominant, there is a possibility of dominant forms of governance, namely democracy. But reality is that we see examples, for example, for the Middle East, that this doesn't seem to be the case. That other forms of governance and political arrangements could have done work better, which is shocking for us who like the democracy. So I'll go along these lines. Sitting under the tree means being rooted with the specific context of that tree.
Okay. Carolyn?
My politics is that if you are thinking about the growth of the city, and especially here in Amsterdam, we build a lot of housing and everything in the city. So last year we had a historical height with more than 8,000 housing. And if you want to do that right, and if you also want to have a good mobile system, and if you also want an energy transition, and if you want a sustainable city, and if you want to have a good urban public space, you have to be very careful how you make that space and how you make that city. So my point about the details is that I think you can do it all, but then you have to go very deep and very in detail of how you're doing it right.
Who decides what is right, what is wrong? How do you understand that? With whom do you have to talk?
It's a question of agency, in fact, and
you have to talk with everyone.
okay.
And you have to, that's true.
The future generations too.
The future generations and the birds that's what you have to do. So you have to be at all levels. You have to be very specific and very in detail of how we do it. Because if we are now developing the city, even in the underground, we have a lack of space. So if we want to make our waste system is a challenge, our transportation system is a challenge. So but I think we can do it, but we have to be very in detail and very specific and very careful of how we do it.
Paul, briefly.
You know, sometimes I have fantasies about becoming mayor of Leeds if there was ever going to be that position. But then I realise I'm really rubbish at politics. So I'm possibly not the best person to answer this, but I think it's something like, and I used to be a bit of an anarchist, so I've got these kind of weird ideas about, you know, we can all self-manage each other, which just, I don't know. So for me, though, urban politics is about 3 levels, right? And I was going through this morning when we were talking, is that the macro level, we need a very different kind of state, an enabling participatory state, right? A really participatory state. So when we say everyone, we mean deliberative citizen councils in every neighbourhood, devolve budgets through participatory budgeting, right? Really clear mechanisms and processes through which decisions are deliberated on and come to and resourced properly. So resourcing, this is key, because policy outcomes cannot be known in advance of participation. Colin Ward said that, my favourite writer, yeah? And that's, you know, that for me, that's it. But it's participation with education, you know, because we can't just say, let the people decide. We've had that one, I think, recently.
We always get that one.
You know,
actually.
so it's like, let's have a deep deliberative process as a nation where we understand each other. That's what we need to do for the next 10 years in Britain, to come to an agreement about what we are as a nation. So anyway, top level macro, enabling participatory state. At the bottom level, going back to what I was saying to this guy, is millions and millions of little micro projects, right? At the micro level, a massive experimentation of like grassroots innovation, hitting all these big problems. And then there's a middle which is missing, the meso level, right? The commons, which is city-based commons institutions across food, energy, housing, transport, water, which is the mediator up and down the broker, right? Which holds the narrative, which holds the macro to account and pulls the resources down to the micro. And this is what we haven't got. So a common city-owned public commons, a citizen commons authority on housing, right? A big cooperative on land, housing, finance, all that kind of stuff, right? So that's my vision, macro, meso, micro. If that got me elected to mayor, I'm going to do it, but it won't work.
Okay.
Right, yeah, I have another question. I'm a little bit surprised by the fact that we discuss topics very separately. When we talk about artists, it's one of the topics. Another topic is transportation, and a third topic is housing, for example. And personally, I would say that there is for sure a lot of potential that we still don't understand in between. And I would say that also a part of the solution might be, we might find a part of the solution if we become a little bit more flexible in thinking about these different parts of our society and find urban experimentation where it comes together. However, for these experiments, and I know quite some in the city of Amsterdam, they are limited by regulations that are set based on our current system that's working in these different assets. So, for example, transportation and housing. And to finish it off, and this comes back to the first question asked about ADM. It might be a good example. Personally, I would say that they are really discovering a new way of living, working, being creative, sustaining. And now it's gone. It had great potential to learn from that, also in the social gains. So, are there not possibilities to make this more visible in the city and give more space to this?
Good question. Carolyn, you want to say something about also why ADM is gone?
No.
I'm joking.
I'm joking. No. We have that debate on the other tables, and I'm not going to respond to that. But I think it's we have now. If you see, the city is growing, and I agree with that. That we have working, housing. Other commercial detail shops that we have separated now from each other. But I think we have to learn that we can do it also together, and that we are more integrated, especially in real estate. And what you see is that we are now learning how to do that. So we are making now more offices with housing inside, or more shops with housing above, or more things that are working spaces for artists with housing together. But I think we are not really, we have to learn from that. And we are now learning that.
There is a last question on this side, and the first question from this side, the other side of the room.
Oh, sorry. Thank you very much for being here. I've heard a lot about housing, and I think it's important. But that being that we're in a globalized city, and also we're a major city in Europe, rethinking urban growth, and also another rhetoric, which is degrowth. I think an important factor to analyze also is entrepreneurialism. So a lot of entrepreneurs have a vision and come to Amsterdam with an imaginative of growing and trying to expand, and that gives a lot of jobs and a lot of innovation. What happens if governing rhetoric around Amsterdam of degrowth or stagnating this urban growth actually affects on this imaginative, and we stop seeing entrepreneurs and people with with the high potential of being innovative start leaving Amsterdam? Isn't this a political and even a social worry that, considering that it's so easy to move for entrepreneurs to move from one city to another, or from even from one country to another, specifically here in Europe, that with this rhetoric, and even if this starts into a political movement, you'll have a major exit of entrepreneurs or people that wish to come to Amsterdam and even local people who want to stay here to create businesses and to create jobs at the same time.
Yes, this is the last question of the first part. So, what kind of economy, in fact, what's the nature of the economy of a city which is also, prosperous but also innovative, diverse? Who wants to answer? Carolyn and then Antonio?
Yeah, perhaps. Well, if you now look to Amsterdam, what we are aiming at is that we have a very diverse economy. So it's not only about the cultural class or about offices or about productive sites, but it's about everything that makes the economy roll. And I think, well, that can be a strategy that if one part leaves the city, there are other parts that also be there. So we still have jobs. But I also think that we go to a major shift in the way we work. So, and I think we have to adapt to that also, and we are not there.
You want to say something, Paul, and then Antonio, pitch.
I mean, I think you point to the right issue, but for the wrong reasons. And entrepreneurship has been undermined for a long time for different reasons, and it's what Marie was talking about in terms of financialization, because what I see are the greatest minds going into, not into solving the city's problems, but going into financialization, making dodgy financial products, going into messing about with the next iPhone, making it a little bit more innovative, right? Or going into kind of like, fancy financial derivatives. That is the world of enterprise, and that's where the greatest minds are going into. Some of my students from universities going into the corporate sector, Deloitte, KPMG, all that kind of stuff. What we need of a city of enterprise is people who can make blue-green infrastructure, people who can create new building fabrics for the future, people who can know how to run community gardens, people who can build social infrastructure, people who can generate. That's genuine wealth creation. And let's not be fooled by the last 40 years of financialization, which has stripped enterprise of its meaning. So let's see a city of enterprise. Let's see a city that can solve the real problems it faces, like climate breakdown, like social injustice, and not just inventing a slightly better iPhone. I'm not suggesting you are saying that, by the way.
Antonio, last word.
First, I'd like to say that I agree totally.
Few. I was a bit worried.
Yeah. And then I would like to say that your narrative, I understand it, but at the same time I think is a very problematic narrative, because it hides one aspect, which is lately we have been invited to enter an economy that enshrines precarity, that considers a fantastic thing that we are jumping from one job to the other, because we in fact would not have the possibility of staying the same job, in which we are constantly having to adapt. Zygmunt Bauman, who was in Leeds and started and talks about the liquid life, liquid love. We are forced to be liquid in this kind of setup of entrepreneurship. And I'm not so sure if it's a great thing, to be honest.
Okay, with this, I'll close the first part. A round of applause of our first three speakers. Thank you. I invite you to go back to your seats and leave space for the next round. I give the word to my colleague, Tom.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Federico, and also thank you, speakers from the first round from my end. I think it's a wonderful way to, or at least a wonderful, for me, observation to see that one of the ways that we try to understand what is going on in cities and what drives the development of cities and the growth of cities is that we can also openly debate about these mechanisms and understand them and how they work in our daily lives, and what we as individuals are prone to do, or what rules we tend to follow when we discuss our projects, our ambitions, our goals, when we want to improve the urban environment, and how we are some way also in that sense boxed in by all kinds of rules that are working inside the practices that we work in and that we study as academics. And that's the little bridge that I want to make to the work that we do and we discuss thoroughly with the UvA at TU Delft, we want to try to understand these processes and how they work in urban environments when we talk about plans for what we call area development in Delft. These are large-scale projects that are supposed to be improving the urban environment, but of course are structured by and influenced by all kinds of mechanisms, rules, and conventions that are sometimes very local, very specific to the city we work in. And Amsterdam has a specific culture about how they debate and work towards plans that are feasible and that are actually in the end built. And we try to compare those practices and understand what rules are sometimes very much under the radar, are not very formalized in some way, but are in some way they grow amongst the people that are working on the city every day. And I think we had a wonderful picture of how you could approach that, and we are trying to bring that back to how we could tomorrow. And I like the question that was asked in the back about that. What could we do then tomorrow to maybe do things a little bit differently, improve things a little bit more? And I just want to ask one question to the room in terms of that sentiment or the feeling that you have of what direction Amsterdam is heading, because there were a lot of questions about Amsterdam, obviously. So who is thinking Amsterdam is definitely moving in the wrong direction at this moment in time in developing it, so growing its city? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the majority thinks, well, things are going in a. Well, yeah, okay. Well, I was asking it bluntly as that in terms of just to see what reaction that would give. But you didn't raise your hand. So what would you say is good or? Yeah. Well, with respect to the issues that have been raised in terms of that the economy is becoming less equitable, that we are not treating the environment as we should treat it, that we are smothering basically the urban transportation, the freedom to move around in the city in every way. So that would be a wrong direction. Should I?
Sorry,
Yeah.
sorry, so many different things.
Yeah.
There are things pulling so many different directions.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it's more that I refuse this
Yeah.
simple a choice. You know?
Okay.
I'm sure not saying, oh, and I also with students I explained that the crucial difference between being hopeful and being either optimist or pessimist. I'm not optimist, so I'm not sure it's going to end well.
Yeah.
I'm not pessimist. I'm not sure it's going to be a mess. But I'm in between, you know, and that's why I discuss with you. I try and do things.
Yeah.
That's
Exactly.
how I see it.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly the way I
Yes.
see it. Are
don't know.
there other burning opinions about this issue? Something people want to share before we start this second round? One over there. I'll come to you with the mic. Just a moment.
Well, just a short remark, maybe you mentioned it's a sentiment, so just a general, without maybe rationalizing it entirely. And that's very interesting, but at first I thought, oh, it's going okay. But then when you named all the various issues, you could say, I was like, I'm not that sure anymore. So that's interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're doing here this evening, to sort of try to understand that. Where do our judgments about where the city's heading come from, and what is important to us as a professional or student in urban studies. To start off our second round, I have 4 pitches for you to head, and I think that first I'll start with Peter Belzer, if I'm correct in the list of speakers for the second round. Peter, would you come up and give us your pitch?
Could have a slide up as well.
I'm here with
Oh, you're here. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Hello. I want to share something with you, which started as a fascination, as a bit of a hobby project, but has actually turned into a worry, a serious worry. And because it's a hobby, I'll read it up, because you have to take hobbies seriously. I want to say something about negative definitions. What I mean by negative definitions is defining where you want to go by describing where you don't want to go. With the sustainability transition taking off, the words depicted here behind me appear frequently in the policy and planning discourse, also tonight actually. They can take the form of a correction of capitalism, like degrowth, a shift away from fossil fuels, like decarbonization, or a call for cities beyond the automobile, like car-free cities. What I'm increasingly wondering, however, is this actually problematic that we use these definitions? And my conclusion, after some thinking, and I'm happy to discuss that later, is yes, this is indeed problematic. And why is that the case? I want to give 3 arguments. Firstly, because these definitions do not contain an idea of where to go in themselves. And I think they therefore are very susceptible to an engineering approach, focusing on technical solutions. The imaginary of the self-driving vehicle or the smart city is often criticized, but it's very difficult, if not impossible, to develop an alternative narrative without the actual language to do so. And I believe climate change is not something we can fix by simply taking out fossil fuels. I think it requires a novel perspective on the good life. Secondly, I think these negative definitions tend to fail to steer the minds of people, to paraphrase Daniel Burnham. Car usage wasn't sold as a story of using fossil fuels, but as the American dream of freedom and luxury. How can we ever build or redevelop successful neighborhoods without natural gas, the so-called aardgasvrije wijken, if the people living in them don't connect to this idea at all? Thirdly, and finally, I think developing an image of the future, like the ones you see behind me, are not just an end goal, but it could be a generative process in itself. Experimenting with novel concepts and practices should, in my view, be one of the core elements of a future urbanism that transforms cities into more sustainable places. Simply arguing in favor of where you don't want to go does not utilize this grand potential. So what I would argue is to make a search for generative and potentially positive ideas of where we want to go. Let's make this part of our dialogue when we rethink urban growth. And let's enjoy all these linguistic puzzles and experimental practices that accompany this. In my view, this is really crucial in rethinking growth as we're doing tonight. And let me end with a quote from the great Dutch futurist Fred Polak, who argued in his book, The Image of the Future, the following. As long as a society's image of the future is positive and flourishing, the flower of culture is in full bloom. Once the image begins to decay and lose its vitality, however, the culture does not long survive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.
Want to sit here?
Yes, please. Yeah. Our second pitch is Hans-Hugo Smit from the developer BPD in this based in this city. Hans-Hugo. The word is.
When you, Tom, invited me last week to participate in today's debate, I very enthusiastically and somewhat naively said yes. And now, after hearing the speakers in the previous round and some of the comments from you guys, I feel a little more, let's say, apprehensive or maybe even frightened to climb the stage or maybe enter the arena. As you mentioned, working for a developer, Bouwfonds Property Development, a large, financially driven, systemic party, but also involved with shaping future cities. I have prepared a 3-minute pitch. It's on my iPhone, not the latest version, I'm glad to say, especially to Paul. And I'll stick to it and then see where it leads us. Bouwfonds Property Development has shifted its focus in the past decades towards more brownfield inner city developments, and in practically all the projects that I, as a area marketeer, concept developer within that company, am involved with, all those projects are urban inner city brownfield projects. And I like that very much. Personally, I've always said that I like to contribute to building better cities, and in my current job with Bouwfonds, I'm in a position to do that, at least in my opinion. So I welcome this shift towards more urban and brownfield developments. And it also fits very neatly with the Dutch policy of limiting new construction to existing urban areas. So both personally and also professionally as a developer, I like that kind of development, the urban developments. It's great on the left-hand side of my slide in the blue circle. That's where I like to be with the urban development. But I've also learned from experience that these urban developments are very time-consuming, complex, and very expensive projects often. And so that sort of contrasts with the current debate, not necessarily here tonight, but in general in the Netherlands, on the need for increasing numbers of new housing units in the urban areas, affordable housing units. And so that could be seen as the other two circles, the speed with which we need to have large numbers of new housing is the fast circle, and the affordability would be in the cheap circle. And I think so. That's my point for this pitch, is that we can't have it all. You can't have anything you want, and maybe part of sitting under the tree is also doing less, wanting less, and then enjoying that, or see where that leads you. And I think that if you want to have the combination of great, resilient, future-proof urban developments, and have it fast in large numbers, and have it affordable and cheap, that combination isn't likely going to happen. We need to choose, and I think that for future urban environments that we all like, we maybe need to focus a little less on the current debate on affordability and numbers, and try to focus more on the kind of cities that we want, and that's what, fortunately, the debate tonight is on. So I think that you can have great and fast. That's basically what we're doing now, but that won't be cheap and affordable. Probably you could also have great urban developments cheaper, but then you would need to look at new urban areas, and that's the right-hand picture. There are a lot of urban areas in the Randstad, in cities or very close to cities, that are green fields by definition maybe, but could be considered urban environments in which you could add a lot of new urban living environments. Like, this is just an example, but a nice one in Hillegom near the train station. You wouldn't say that you're in the Randstad there. So that's an alternative. The other alternative, to have cheap and fast production, probably is very feasible and an option on the short run, but it will probably not lead to the kind of cities that we all want. And so if we want to make better cities, I think that we need to choose. I think it's great to focus on urban developments, maybe even only have urban developments, but then it should be that, and you shouldn't also want to have large numbers in a short amount of time, let alone that it be cheap or affordable. So it's great urban development, and maybe one of the other two, but no more than 2 out of 3. And to paraphrase the great Meatloaf, baby, we can talk all night, but that ain't getting us nowhere. Don't be sad, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans-Hugo. Yeah, and thank you for just sticking to the story you aim to tell.
And not singing it.
Thanks for that as well. Jeroen Zuidgeest, urban designer. Welcome to the stage.
Yeah, I'll start with a, if you don't mind, before I start with my pitch, which is this one, I'll come back to that in a second, but see it as a small bridge. I would like to react to what I see as the would say the red line of, let's say, the conversation of tonight so far, and I would say the missing element in that, so the missing red line maybe. And to me, that comes down to the definition of value. I made a note, so I'll write it out loudly to start. And a couple of the elements have been addressed before, and I would say the required paradigm shift of, let's say, the current urban model, and I would say even say economic model, into one that is more sustainable, inclusive, attractive, requires basically a paradigm shift in the definition of values. And you gave an opening to that, which to me is still not optimistic enough. So see that as compliment and maybe start of a dialogue. My key point is, and see that as, let's say, the bridge to the need for good growth, my pitch, is basically what spatial strategies do we need or can we imagine to challenge and unlock this potential and requires a new reality. So you could say that's basically, in short, the mission statement of my studio. And I'm not going into that tonight. So again, the need for good growth, and again, the sort of white elephant in the room is, let's say, growth and urban development. It's all great. It all seems fantastic. New high-rises, new money, sort of increasing VOZ values. But at the end, you could question if that's, let's say, the complete package, the complete perspective, and if that's a relevant definition. So I would like to sort of illustrate it by two things. So firstly, and that's a project we did at MVDV by then, sort of commissioned by RPB, on the future development of the Netherlands, but you could as well, it's like a passport toto, this is skillless. You could apply this to Amsterdam as well. You could apply this to any master plan, to any design project, is simply to choose to decide based on sort of objective criteria and definitions, and which, and that's my key point, should be defined and guided by a much broader definition of value. And value, again, the word not mentioned at all. I tried to raise my hand a couple of times, but Frederic, you missed it. But I think was a sort of key sort of black hole and missing element in the previous discussions. And our answer to, let's say, the Netherlands, but again, could be Greater Amsterdam as well, could be anything, is to organize things well spatially. It's also not that complicated. Looking at the Netherlands, you need to organize energy well. Blue triangle at the top left, you need to organize your coastal defense, your central park, your river zones, your corridors, and your main ports, period. That's it. Top-down requires a Ministry of Home, spatial planning. Too bad they cut it. So that's my answer to politics. Secondly, and that's, let's say, the other point, is good growth. Growth in itself is not interesting at all. It implies a solely quantitative direction, where to me the shift to a more qualitative direction is much more leads to a much more relevant discussion, and is to me the only way to be able to answer to this needed paradigm shift to come to a sustainable, inclusive, and a just and fair city. So this is just an illustration, but I call it in my practice building a programmatic package, which is simply more complete than the too limited discussion on X number of houses and X number of working places. To me, it's the necessity to broaden up that discussion and come to, let's say, a conversation where it's about what type of society do you want to be, how does that translate itself in type of values. And again, to me, the too narrow and shallow definition of the solely economic ones doesn't lead to the type of community and the type of morals that I believe that we stand for and that we share in this room, period.
Thank you, Jeroen. And finally, Hans van Rossum from Rotterdam. Very welcome, as well as Jeroen. The last pitch.
Hans-Hugo, you're in good company because I own a development company, and there's nothing worse than that. But before that, I used to be the chief of the development company of the city of Rotterdam as well. And I never prepare a pitch like this, because it's just like urban growth or a setting like this. You think you know you're heading the right direction, and then suddenly there's a lot of change. Everything, the world is moving so fast. The setting of a surrounding like this could be so different than I used to have in my head when I took the train from Rotterdam to Amsterdam. So I just try to combine all things and come back to the first elements we started with when we talked about urban growth, which for me is about social growth for a lot of people, for cities, the people who live there, the people who want to live there, the people who want to leave cities. There's actually still a big group of people who want peace and quiet in the central park of the Netherlands. About economical growth, getting new jobs, getting the right jobs, very important. Getting all the people into jobs instead of the happy few. And urban growth. People want to live in the city. How do they want to live in the city? Where do they want to live in the city? Why do they want to live in the city? Etc. So when I used to work for the government, what we try to do is making this map. And this map is not about here you can build 6 houses or there you can build 6 schools. It's about combining these elements, combining social, economical, and urban development. And instead of drowning into such an amount of details, which I recognize in your story, because it's so difficult to oversee all the elements who are necessary and relevant in these urban growth items, what we try to do is keeping ourselves to the big picture, which is far more complicated than it looks like in the beginning. Because what is your economical growth? What does it look like? What are the relevant economical clusters? Can you stick to your plan? And how do you combine it to your social development skills for the rest of the inhabitants of your city? And so if you know those themes, where are you going to develop it? And if you know where to develop, my very personal point of view is stop doing it yourself as a governmental organization and leave that up to the people who have more other drivers, even better drivers sometimes, and work very closely together. It's not about black and white, it's not about right or wrong. It's trying to combine all those elements and keep the big picture in head and then try to achieve that goals.
Thank you, Hans. So I would like to open up the floor for questions, and it would be interesting to just hear first some opinions and some reactions to the pitches. And please state your name and who you want to address.
I'm Anna Nikolaeva. I work at the UvA, and I have a question for Peter Pelzer. I think there is a seed of truth in what you're saying, and I understand the reasoning behind it, but I really would like to take the issue with the fear of negativity. I think, first of all, there are already ideas, labels that do not have the D, the non. For example, we have sustainable development, which transformed into an empty shell. We have green growth, which is very problematic. We even have smart city. A lot of people love it, and we have even livability, which also is not necessarily going to save the world, maybe pretty idea by itself, but doesn't necessarily have the power to mobilize political action. But in general, so that's one argument. And the other argument, I think there are things that we should be able to say, we don't want this. Sometimes something wrong may be happening in front of your eyes. I don't know, somebody is beating someone, torture, somebody's smoking, whatever is your, scale of negative things happening. And sometimes you just want to say, don't do this, don't stop this, and so forth. So I think we should be able to do that. And if you think about history of political and social activism, a lot of people changed the world because they said, stop and don't, and, and used all those negatives that we are so afraid of. If we want, I think when we want to mobilize the imagination of people, I think it's fantastic on the one hand, but aren't we treating them as kind of spoiled consumers or spoiled children because we don't want to prohibit them things, but we want to entertain them?
Peter.
I understand your point, and I'm also not arguing that critique on our current system is a bad thing in itself. I think that's very important. But if you, this comes back to Luca's point of politics and your theory of change, I don't think that suffices to bring about this sustainable transformation we're facing. I don't think that we'll have enough people kind of fitting into this discourse or fitting into this narrative. And I do believe in the case that kind of Buckminster Fuller's idea that you don't just have to fight the existing system, but also make it redundant, is still quite powerful. And personally, I'm a planner, and if you look at the history of Dutch planning, I think many of the the great planners, they didn't develop this Dutch system, which you can critique, of course, by saying this is where we don't want to go. They had a very clear vision of where to go, a licht, lucht en ruimte, as the modernists said. So I think developing this kind of body of knowledge, this paradigm, is really quite critical. And in a way, if you think, for instance, about it was the civil rights movement, that really became the key term. It was about civil rights. It was about rights, about equality, and they are terms that are in a way positively laden. So I would not say we should neglect entirely this critique, but if I look at the Dutch, particularly policy discourse, there's a big project now on aardgasvrije wijken. And I think that's hugely problematic because that's very technocratic and that's very defining where you don't want to go. And I think we could do better with regard to our neighborhoods.
I have somebody here who is burning to react to that.
Yeah, just a short reaction on your framing of Dutch planning as only conveying positive narratives. I do think it was very much based also on the negative side. The idea of Los Angelesization was a very powerful idea which was behind all the ideas of urbanization policies in the Netherlands for decades. If you look at the work of people like Tversky and Kahneman, psychologists who think about framing a lot, they say that when people experience a narrative of loss, they are prepared to take risks. I don't know which conclusions in this case you can draw, but you see that people react to the climate change debate in two ways. It's a horror scenario, which brings people to say, okay, we must change a lot. But other people see it as a narrative of loss because they are afraid that they lose their way of life. So it's not, it is about convincing people, but yeah, you should have a bit more thorough theory about how people are moved in changing their views. And there is conflict anyway.
Yeah, so okay, to respond to that, I mean, this is not a theory yet. This is a fascination. And I don't think you provide a convincing theory either, because my counter-argument would be, we have this climate, we know of this climate crisis now for 20 years, 30 years. We're doing nothing. In Paris, again, nothing is happening. So I think, yeah, we need to think beyond that. And I think this is also something that someone like Amitav Ghosh argues. We need to think about how do we tell our narratives. And I think, at least if I look at focusing mostly on what I see in the Dutch context, I think this putting a word like decarbonization, just saying, well, this is what we don't want, or post, beyond, I think you're not solving the issue. You're just pointing at what's wrong, and you're kind of reiterating the diagnosis. But we've been having this diagnosis for 20 years now, and I think we really need to think beyond.
Hans, I thought you were...
No, I would like to add to it, because
if
you don't mind, I think it's a quite interesting point, but I think both arguments are true, and I'm not trying to sound like a politician here. I'm not advocating for the middle, but I'm advocating for making the opposites more extreme. So your point, I wouldn't agree less, and that's a methodology I prefer to use, is a sort of a call for awareness following urgencies. If we continue like this is what's going to happen. And well, it's not about aardgasvrije wijk anymore, since there's no neighborhoods anymore at all. So to clarify that. Secondly, so my point again, to come back to the issue of values, not to sort of cover it up. And yeah, you started with the question. Agree, it wasn't sort of fully sharply defined, but is it all going well? No, it's not going well at all if you take into account all these other criteria. And I think we should be much more sort of honest and objective and communicative about this to, let's say, on high governmental level, on economic level, and let's say all other professions. On the other hand, and that's why I found, let's say, your strategy extremely sort of powerful, but I also said it's not, to me, not optimistic enough to simply sort of mirror that, like, where are we able to go if we sort of, if this is the urgency, if we don't do anything, and what are the alternatives, and what are the sort of measures required in between to take the steps to be able to come there. And I think both are very, again, powerful ways to sort of accelerate the discussion. So let's go. Yeah.
Thank you. Verder.
I have a question for Jeroen. I really like the proposition to think and design by values. So I want your design perspective on this. What kind of approach to design and urban design and planning do we need in order to nurture new values that are not the monetary values that are quite diffused today? I mean reciprocity, solidarity, tradition and history. So these are fundamental, I think, also propositional in relation to what Peter says. So what kind of spaces, in fact, do we need for nurturing this type of alternative values to the commodification or exchange?
Yeah, I can give two answers. One can be on a very theoretical academic level, which I'm not going to do, and secondly is the extremely sort of human small-scale level. And when I left MVDV, I got this great gift by my team member, and they kind of covered or collected slogans that are apparently used, or phrases that I seem to use quite a lot. And to make a design which is understandable for my grandmother and my daughter apparently was something I use quite often. And I like to use both of them as a metaphor in urban development or design development because of two ways. Firstly, to cut, let's say, the bullshit out, simply the need for hyperclarity to be able to convey the message. So that's my grandmother. Secondly, and that's my daughter, we all have kids, we all have loved ones, we all have wives, men, we all have kids, etc. And at the end, qualities in life to me are extremely sort of tangible and simplistic. Let's say the cup of coffee in the sun in the corner of a street with your loved one is something sort of unbeatable and is understandable, I would say, to anybody in the world, from Trump real estate developers, dictators, to ecologic activists, roughly saying. They should be layered. It needs to be theorized. It needs to be sort of, apparently we're only able to sort of quantify economic values into the KBA's, so the MKBA's. It's a discussion I've been having many times the last decades, but at the end it's the other values which are simply more important than the ones that we're able to crack at this moment, which says something about our strategic intellect or something at this level. I'm not sure, but that's maybe a question to pose to you as academics, with a wink.
Can I, Tom?
Yes, please.
After being put in the corner with Trump and dictators,
no.
The real estate developer wants to say something, but a lot of the discussion is about the system, and as a developer, I'm active in the system, and then you might argue that that's part of the problem, but in that reality, and for me trying to contribute to the debate, what I very much like about the picture you showed, and kinds of visions or images of a possible future on that level, is that it is a positive way of saying this is what we want, although maybe also some do not or stops. For me as a developer, I like that. I want a government giving me a clarity, a point on the horizon where we are going. Not too detailed. It might pinpoint to details, because I agree with Carolyn that in the end it's the details that count and that make an urban environment attractive or pleasant. But I wouldn't want the government prescribing it in detail beforehand, because that sort of erases all creativity and flexibility, as you mentioned, in the process. And so, regardless of you framing it in a negative way or a forbidding way or a more hopeful way, but the point I was making is that you should stop stagging your requirements and leave it at the point at the horizon.
Would it help to define a set of values and then leave all the details out and say, well, this is what the development of this site or this part of the city or the city as a whole, what values it should strive for?
I think it would. And also the knowing that you can't have it all. So make choices and set values for that, but do not add extras on less important matters.
One question here.
Yes, so I also see this rhetoric of changing the value from monetary, but in that sense, it's very difficult, and sometimes I say only over here, right? Only in the high developed Western society do we hear that, because yes, you could. The best things can be having a coffee and sitting down, or maybe having a nice sleep. But the reason why, in many reasons, you can have a nice coffee without worrying, and you can have a nice sleep, is because you're not worried that if you have an accident walking to that cafe, you don't have money to pay that social service. And even though you are not personally paying it, because in the government pays it for you, they do need money, and they do that through taxes, which is money. So in that sense, money for a lot of people and in a lot of developed places gives you a sense of security, and valuing money is not only the money itself, but what money can give you, and that's health. That's also good food, because in a lot of places you cannot buy healthy food if you don't have money, and this moving away from money because money is vice. But we actually have to think what money can give the society in terms of means to an end, security, health, welfare, and that only happens through actually valuing that means itself to get it. So, what would you say to this rhetoric that it devalues money when money can actually give you security and health and good food and this innovation? Thank you very much.
A response from?
Well, I think urban growth or development, what you're saying is really part of that. I mean, it's about self-awareness and responsibility, and I think that what we are trying to do in this very wealthy environment, indeed, is try to make that accessible for more people. And as long as we are aware, it's not just for the happy few, and be very aware of the wealth we have right now and our responsibility to broaden that. Urban growth and urban development is about the themes you're just mentioning. So I very much agree.
Yeah, so the city is a redistribution system, or should be. I'm reluctant to give the mic to you. But I trust you.
I have a question to the first speaker, because I fully agree with you that the proliferation of the empty signifiers that we love to discuss so much, energy transition, post-carbon, socially just cities. Anyone against any of those metaphors? I agree with you that they point to a techno-managerial solution, and in doing so, you crowd out visions about what good urban life really is all about. I fully agree with that. My slight caveat is that our worst enemies, those who are driving our cities in the wrong direction, know what they want. They have a vision. The big developers, OMA, Arup, in conjunction with institutional investors who buy up numbers of flats in Amsterdam, have a vision of what a good life is. They know what the politics of their urban dream is. And we'll see it again in Davos in 2 weeks' time. The problem is us. We do not know what we want. And by we, I mean the liberal humanitarians, those who mean well, but can only proliferate empty signifiers. So isn't it the case that the problem of the absence of a vision of a good life resides with us, the chattering classes who come to the Zwijger on an evening like that, and who seem to mean well, while those who we would like to contest, to stop as another stop, know what they want. They know precisely what they want. Someone like Geert Wilders in the Netherlands knows what kind of Amsterdam he wants. What the city we want.
So you can fight against it every single day and be very mad about it. But these people, these companies, they exist. They're part of our life. They're part of our system. Use it in the good way. We are being financed in a very big project, Feyenoord City, maybe you've heard of it, by Goldman Sachs. Almost a couple of hundred of millions of dollars. We use it to develop apartments. We also use it to educate people in the surrounding neighborhoods on education, on social development, sport, etc. So you can say, stop working with them, demolish them, etc., or use it, work with them and use it in the right way. Of course they know what they want. You can read it on paper 1 of their financial report, so it's not a big...
Well, thanks for these contributions so far. I would like to add, perhaps, in terms of empty signifiers and in terms of these discussions we're having about how to frame things or how to create narratives. I think perhaps one of the reasons that we, as the well-meaning people, keep making empty signifiers instead of something that really is recognizable for people might be because we refuse to acknowledge or to include in that the side of the human being that is not amazingly humanitarian. And that is not to say that we should therefore focus, as capitalism generally does, on the negative sides, let's say, in terms of greed or in terms of laziness or in terms of just wanting to define our good life as only our own, and instead to really try to understand that we have both of those sides inside of us, each one of us does, and we need to create a narrative perhaps that acknowledges exactly both of those instead of trying to pretend we are just socially just people or that we are not. And that is an exciting narrative that I would be, looking forward to or trying to produce as well.
Yeah, it resonates with me. The mirror of society that Richard Rorty has been writing about. Peter, do you have a response?
Yeah, maybe responding to the caveat, because I would largely agree with that, because I think, but in a way, the problem is not. It's actually quite similar for these, let's say, generative ideas about the future and about these negative definitions. In both ways, there is a big capital, if you will, that might take over the story. And in a way, that this is how we came into our current fossil-dependent system. So I agree with that analysis and that diagnosis. I'm wondering first on how to get out of this. I'm also maybe a bit more positive view on property developers and also on corporations in not just being the evil, but also having a changing perspective on brownfield development, on social inclusion, etc. So I see silver linings. I see a lot of silver linings also with you. So that would be the first observation. And the second thing is. So maybe give a personal example. I live here in Amsterdam West, and I got a note that they do participatory budgeting now. Right? So there's 300,000 euros, and then I have to decide, what project will they do? And in principle, I think that it's a great experiment. It's great that you experiment with democracy like this. But, and this comes back to the earlier point about education and deliberation, I'm not sure if we as a society are ready for this at the moment, to really give us some choices and choose what do we want. So I think, and this might be a bit of an open answer, but I learned while also reading the work of Paul Locke that this idea of futures literacy, being able to talk about what future you want, I think there's really an entry point in there that we also in our teaching, we teach history, we teach geography, but we do not teach futures thinking. Well, perhaps that might be in the long run an entry point to have better discussions about the future. So that is an answer. So, but if this fascination ever turns into a theory, I'll take up your caveat. So thanks for that.
Room for a couple of more questions. Yeah.
I would like to ask about the pitch about Rotterdam. You made a very interesting statement, and don't let urban planning to the government, let other sectors to do it. That's very interesting, intriguing for me. Can you explain more about that? The reason is, I work in cities in Asia. I think the scale is much larger than Amsterdam. I think what we discussed tonight is very luxury issues compared to what happened there, where when urban planning, city development are managed by WhatsApp, from presidents to the mayor. So I think that in compared to the cities where I work in Asia, Amsterdam is a perfect place to live, and also the system work here. But still, or in Holland. But still, you made that statement, don't let the government to do it, give it to other parties. What do you mean about it?
That's a bit of
I think it's only part of your statement, but go ahead.
What I'm trying to say is that in general, and again, this is not black or white, but in general, policy making is not really well done by entrepreneurs. So leave policy making and long-term development and setting goals to the government. Governments, in general, keep on talking about all the details and the policy and the politics of their choices, which is kind of difficult for them. And entrepreneurs are rational, economical-based people who can decide very quickly and fill in the gaps. So if you combine those elements and work very closely together and start rephrasing and keep focusing on the end goals, I think that can be very effective and very successful. It's very hard for people to lose up a bit, so they feel responsible and want to be responsible for every single detail to the end. But if you see that other people can do what you think is necessary, the combination is very powerful, I believe.
I totally agree with you, and there are huge difference by definition between a government and market parties or entrepreneurs, and so know that and use that, and everyone should do what they do best. But then coming back to the previous issue, I also like the notion that we all, wherever you work, we all are human with our positive and less positive learning aspects. And I think that in a post-Marxist worldview, I can probably not be both working for a real estate developer and be a more humanitarian, liberal, nice person who wants to contribute to better cities. But in a post-Marxist worldview, I can, and I know that I am, or at least I try to be, and that's why I'm here this evening. And so if someone would say that these large parties know what they want, I would like to invite you to come and visit us for a while and then probably be surprised by what we do not know, although we might suggest otherwise sometimes, but also what we do know on this human aspect of wanting to contribute to better cities. And so regardless of each and everyone's different roles, in the end, a lot of us are nice people in their way wanting to contribute to better cities, and that's something we can tap into more probably on evenings like this, so it's a good start.
And knowing our natural inclinations, we could keep each other in check, as Hans has described, as you collaborate and talk with each other and keep each other sharp. Yeah.
I would like to add as well, because I couldn't agree less. I would definitely opt for what I call a more strategic way of planning. So, and that's what also sort of intended to illustrate with this map of the Netherlands, to simply clarify the sort of common goals, the shared sort of ambitious principles for development that need indeed long-term planning, need policies, etc. That simply belong to at governmental level. But secondly, to simply leave room, being to development parties, being to investors, being to local and private initiatives, to sort of unlock the potential of intellect and creativity in development processes afterwards. So to completely tighten up things up front simply sort of kills that. We had a brief discussion during dinner in relation to, let's say, the Oosterwold development in Almere, where it was sort of deliberate choice to radically leave everything open, and we couldn't imagine to what beautiful initiatives this led at the end. So it's simply, I would say, a twofold strategy. Firstly, to fix and to focus on and to agree upon what you really need to organize. But secondly, also to definitely be a bit more sort of relaxed, as Hans mentioned as well, have sort of slight laissez-faire attitude in a positive sense to unlock this potential of the intellect and creativity of the community in a wider sense.
Okay. These two more questions and then we'll have to...
A quote, "I will just keep on building. You do what you can to stop me, if you can." Does anyone know who said that? One? Does it sound, I heard it sounds like a developer, right? It was Robert Moses, planner for New York. Mm-hmm. So it's very interesting because we shifted from talking about growth to talking about urban visions. And maybe that's what we should be talking about instead of growth per se, because it's an ill-defined term since the beginning, as Giacomo pointed out. So if we start talking about vision, a very interesting point to make is we can move beyond good and bad people. The people have the vision and those who don't have a clear vision. And a very important question, and we may want to talk about it further, is how did planners move from having a very clear, concrete vision that was just out there to materialize to, wishy-washy, maybe we can do this, but we have this 300,000, you tell us what to do with it, because we don't know. So to me, this is a very important issue to tackle, understand, and maybe to ask ourselves, in terms of collaboration between planners and developers, there might be new synergies there if we talk about vision and what planners can do about enforcing this vision. I don't know if any planner in the room.
Yeah. Well, maybe first, Hans-Hugo, you also mentioned you also have to figure things out within your walls to see what is our vision. Does it help to talk with planners and collaborate, like Hans was saying about finding those?
It
broader
does,
vision?
and I think one of the advantages of working for a larger company is that we have a lot of people that as a large part of their jobs is to try and reach out to the academia or to contributing to debates and trying to learn from other experiences. And so we are not just a project developer, but we are also trying to be at least a learning company, trying to relate to other parties, other stakeholders, other views, because we know that only by relating to those different views, we can simply make our projects. If that answers your question.
Yeah, maybe Carolyn, you want to add something as a planner? You asked for a planner.
Well, as I was thinking about the strategic planning for Holland, and then we get the Zwijger. So I don't think if that's the best example of the government and the market. So I think what the government and the public has to do is to set high ambitions and to challenge ourselves what to do with the growth in our cities.
And challenge ourselves means the companies like BPD as well as the larger community, as Jeroen has mentioned.
Yeah, so it's about challenging the companies, and I have worked also on Oosterwold, so I know what the creativity of the people can do and can master. And I think if we give them space, we can make also beautiful things. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. It is well past 10 o'clock, so I do invite everybody to, of course, stay and debate further after we wrap up this session. And I would like firstly to thank you all for the great questions and the great debate we've now achieved with each other tonight. Thank the speakers for your pitches and for being here tonight. And I think that we could not have, obviously, as Federico already said, could not have done this without the help of Slim, who has kindly sponsored this event, and is one in 3 events that will happen this spring. The next will be a session we will have in Delft about the predicament of mobility and the densification of our cities, at least what is on the agenda, as was pointed out by Peter and other speakers as well, that how do we deal with that? We want to create spaces for more people inside our cities and still keep them well accessible. This will be on the 13th of February, but will be in Dutch. We also have a course that I want to point out to the students in the room that we use in Delft, what we call the Urban Redevelopment Game. It's in Q4 of every academic year. Check it out on the website. It's a course that can be taken for, I think it's 10 credits. So it's an interesting way to get students engaged in the dilemmas, actually, that we've been talking about also tonight, and to negotiate with, for example, between planners and developers about concrete projects. So that's a way that we use to experience those. How do we resolve the dilemmas, and how do we find the values that we want to discover with each other? What do we find worthwhile to strive for in building our cities and redeveloping our cities? So that's what I also want to conclude with, because that's a major takeaway for me, at least. We need a new, broader set of values that drives city planning, urban development. And yes, we've become prone to let our ears hang towards the financial benefits of projects, but we should break open that discussion and see what other values are really important to people that live in cities and want to thrive in cities. So I think that's really something to do and an assignment for us all. And I think it's very important, and I thank you all again, because these are the kinds of settings that we actually use to debate these issues. And we talk to each other. We do not need to go into the pitfall of not talking to the developers at the table, because we don't like them very much. If we open that stage like this and we talk about this, it's really something where change maybe begins. But that's my humble opinion. Build these relationships and see how these relationships are sustained within the planning system that we have, and understand that planning system as something, as a social phenomenon, which helps us to understand the values that drive our city. So that's something that I just want to end up with. I hope you've all found it worthwhile to be here tonight, and I thank you all, and let's continue talking over the drinks. Federico, do I need to give you something more to say to conclude, or? No. Yeah?
No, give here.
Yeah, but I mean, I think you want me to say this. That's what you want. Yes, basically, our colleague from Pakhuis, Zwijger, told us, we really need your support to keep this space going, because we are struggling. So tell your audience this, that you can, help them to stay alive in a city which is densifying, and it costs a lot of money to stay alive here if you do debates. Well, have a look at the program. I'm not going to do any explanation of this. There's more program. I also want to thank Tom and Slim again, and well, have a good night.